Well, a warm welcome to everyone on this chilly day. Good to see you here. A special welcome to guests who may be with us for the first time. Maybe you're visiting family in town and you're here. We want to welcome you. Welcome to everyone online. And a really special welcome to all the university and college students back home for Christmas. It is a delight to see you here this morning. And if you're new, to give you a quick update, to bring you up to speed on what we've been doing here for the past couple of weeks at ClearView, we have been walking through, in the season of Advent, we've been exploring these songs that are surrounding Christmas. We're calling it a Christmas playlist. It's interesting, you know musicals, right? Like Hamilton or Les Mis or Come From Away. In those musicals, you have, it starts out with some action and then some conversation, and then people break out into a song, and then you got some action and people break out into a song. And that's sort of what is going on in the Christmas story, too. You read through the Christmas story and events are happening, and then all of a sudden people are regularly breaking out into song. We've been looking at 4 of them. And they traditionally have these Latin names attached to them based on the Latin translation of the first line of the song. So first you got Mary, Mary's Magnificat. And then you got Zechariah's Benedictus. And then you have the angels singing the Gloria in Excelsis Deo. And today we explore the 4th song, which comes after the birth of Jesus, a song by Simeon with the funky Latin name called the Nunc Dimittis. It sounds like a good band name, doesn't it? The Nunc Dimittis, which is the first words of Simeon's song. Lord, dismiss your servants in peace. So we have the lyrics for these songs, the text in our Bibles. But I've often wondered what tunes would accompany these songs. What sort of musical genres would carry these lyrics? Would it be, I don't know, a Caribbean reggae beat? Would it indie rock, hip hop, country, choral? The first 3 are these big songs. Mary's Magnify the Lord, and Zechariah's Bless the Lord, and then of course the angel, the choir, Gloria in Excelsis Deo. I mean, they're going to be big, they're going to be loud songs, right? But this last one, Simeon's song, has this totally different vibe to it, this totally different feel. It's such a tender song. I'm thinking, if I had to score it, Simeon's song has this quiet guitar just picking out a really gentle melody in the background. And Simeon is almost just whispering this song. I think it's probably a lullaby, this song of Simeon. Now, unlike all the other songs, there's no big fanfare surrounding this story. There's no choirs of angels. There's no miracles happening. And Simeon is a pretty regular dude, right? He's not a king. He's not a prophet. He has no public ministry. He's not a revolutionary. He's an ordinary guy who, for decades, has been waiting around the temple with this extraordinary hope, because the Spirit told him that one day he would see the Messiah, that long-promised hope. He would see it before he died. And so Simeon, this devout, now old, elderly man, he's been waiting his whole life. He's got a promise from God that he's clinging on to, a promise that he will not die until he sees the Messiah. But who knows how long he's been sort of holding on to that promise. Years, probably decades. And you wonder, how long can he hold on? All his life he's heard these stories of God. He's heard the promises that God is going to come. God is going to come in power. God is going to save. He's believed them. But oh my, it's been hard to believe, to hang on to that, because all he can see around him is evidence to the contrary. Like, he does not see a shred of evidence that God is actually going to deliver on this promise, because all he can see is a world controlled by Roman power, Roman propaganda that promised the Roman peace. It's called the Pax Romana, which was everyone's going to enjoy the goodness of this Roman peace. But he knew this was not a peace for everyone. I mean, there were too many people left out of that Roman promise. And so Simeon, disillusioned with that, disillusioned with all he sees, he comes quite regularly to the temple to pray, to hope for a better day, for a different king. But the temple, that's sort of a disappointment too for Simeon. It's hardly like the old temple. This temple that he comes to is what they call the second temple. It's been rebuilt, but it's a pretty shabby version of the first. Like, it never offered any proof of God's presence there. The Israelites first had the tabernacle, which God's glory filled. It descended to it. And then the Temple of Solomon, the first temple, there was heavenly fire on the altar. But this rebuilt temple, this is pretty disappointing. The old glory felt gone. So Simeon is hanging on to this promise when it seems like God is just missing. And I read Simeon's story and I can't help but think, man, that sort of describes the moment we are in the Western culture, isn't it? Where so many people feel like are giving up on faith, where they no longer come to church. All you university and college students who are back, you sort of know this, because the university campuses are pretty devoid of any mention or presence of God. Well, not presence, but mention. And you're part of a generation that is disappearing from churches and from faith, which is why I'm so delighted you're here this morning. And many people, when they see that landscape in our culture, are asking, like, what is going on, right? Many people see the statistics and they think, well, you know what, people have just given up on God. It's a lack of desire for God. I don't believe that, actually. Many others don't either. There's a professor of psychology, his name is Dr. Richard Beck in the U.S., and he engages regularly. Obviously, he teaches university, so he's engaging with students and young adults. And he sees the disappearance of young adults from churches, from faith. But he doesn't believe young adults, that generation, are giving up on God. He says so many young adults in the West do desire God and desire Him deeply. They just don't know it. And he's got a psychologist's hat on here, and he's doing a diagnosis of our culture. And he writes this, he says, everywhere you look in North America, you see this longing for God, but an entire generation know this by another name. He says they call it anxiety or depression or loneliness. He says you see it in rising rates of suicide and addiction. People are in pain, but they've lost the ability to correctly name and diagnose the hurt. The only language, he says, these young generations have for God is the language of mental illness. And when they say anxiety or depression, they're expressing a desire for God. Now, he's a psychologist, so you got to know, he's not suggesting that diagnosable mental illness is fixed by a come to Jesus moment, okay? He's not saying that, please. But he is taking note of the staggering rates of depression and loneliness and addiction, all on the rise among young adults and young people. And he's wondering, why is everyone so anxious and so unsettled and feeling so fragile within themselves? And everyone's trying to find answers, right? Everyone's got different answers. Well, it's because of the political polarization. There's so much fighting and squabbling going on. It's social media. It's the economic struggles. It's environmental doom and collapse. And yeah, those are part of it, the complexity we live in, right? But he says those aren't causes. Those are stressors, for sure. And if we were more healthy, we could handle those stressors. But we're vulnerable. We're struggling to cope. And we're living with this deep ache. All those words, he says, we use: anxiety, loneliness, meaninglessness, cynicism, hopelessness, angst, boredom. All those words, he says, are words we use for what it feels like when God is missing. You know those crime scenes where they often use a chalk outline where there's once was a body? This psychologist, Richard Beck, he says all those words, anxiety, depression, loneliness, he says those are like the chalk line marking out the space that God once occupied in our lives, in our culture. We live in a secular age that has sort of dismissed God. And the ache, all those words, is the pain and unease we feel without God in our lives. And in a time that is just devoted to doubting and questioning everything, is it any wonder that we feel so fragile and anxious? Have you felt that? Have you felt those words, anxiety, depression, loneliness, meaningless? Are those words that you would use to describe what you often feel in your life? That's the chalk line, the hole that's in your life, because God is missing. That ache actually is a sign. It's sort of like a warning sign on the dashboard of your light, an indicator light, that actually God is at work, is present in your life. It's a sign that your soul is so great that it requires a greater good to satisfy and to fill you, and that what you've tried to fill it, it is just not doing the job. You know, in the Christmas carol, Joy to the World, we sing the line, "Let every heart prepare him room." Sometimes God uses that ache to prepare room, to stir up something in our hearts, to get us longing for more. It prepares room in our lives for Jesus. Sometimes God graciously and tenderly frustrates our lives to fill us with longings and desires that this world will not offer to us, but can only be found elsewhere. C.S. Lewis, who is the Oxford scholar, he was an atheist, grew up an atheist, and he experienced this ache, this inconsolable longing, he called it. And he wrote about this in a classic essay or sermon called The Weight of Glory. And he says most people, if they learned to look in their own hearts, would know that they do want, and they want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of these things this world has to offer to give it to you, but they never keep their promise. The longings which arise in us when we first fall in love, or think of a foreign country that we want to visit and travel to, or first take up some subject or task that excites us, or begin a career. All those longings, these are longings for which no marriage, no travel, no learning, no job will ever be able to satisfy. And then he goes on, he says, you know, I'm not talking about what you might ordinarily call unsuccessful marriages or trips that are bad. He says, I'm talking about the best possible ones. There is always something we grasp at, he says, in that first moment of longing that fades away in the reality of it. The spouse was a good spouse. The scenery of the place we visited to was excellent. And it turned out to be a really great job, but it all just evades us. And it turns out we don't have what we thought. And what we're left with is that ache, right? That disappointment. And very often what we'll do is we'll blame those things. Well, I just need a more attentive spouse, actually. Or I need a better job with a better boss and a better pay. I need a bigger house. I need more trips, a better life, and then I'll be happy. No. Someone said the worst thing God can do for you is give you everything you ever thought would make you happy, because when you finally get it, you're going to realize that is not it. That does not satisfy my deepest hopes. This does not fulfill me. It leaves you even worse. You need to realize there's a hole in your heart so big We so often underestimate the greatness of our own souls. And if you think that a great sports car or a trophy spouse or fame, or if you could just get into that line of work and find greater career success or money, if you think that's going to satisfy your soul, you don't know how great your soul is. You will not be satisfied with anything less than a greater comfort. Back to Simeon. We read that Simeon, as he was going about every day, going to the temple, was waiting for the consolation of Israel. Interesting phrase, consolation. To console someone is to comfort them in the middle of a grief, of a hard thing, right? To console is to alleviate a grief, a sadness. To comfort is to take away the edge of that loss and disappointment. To console is to help make sense of the situation that makes no sense. Consolation is something that accounts for all the different parts, even the broken parts, and somehow stitches it together. It provides meaning. It provides a context of hope. Simeon was waiting for the consolation of Israel, waiting, hoping for God to somehow make sense, to personally intervene in world affairs. He was probably hoping for some political help, right? To kick some Roman butt out of there. That's what he was hoping for. He was hoping for the restoration of the glory of his nation, which had been torn in two for 1,000 years or so. That hope that Simeon was looking for, it sort of harks back to Isaiah 40, where the prophet says, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, her iniquity is pardoned." But a new political situation, a new leader, a new temple even, that wouldn't console the ache he felt. That wouldn't bring the consolation he needed. And so the Spirit moved Simeon to go to the temple, to go to this one couple. And it's amazing. The temple would be filled with all sorts of families doing their religious duty, but the Spirit moves Simeon to say, "That's the one. Look." And the Spirit nudges Simeon to that one couple with their baby. And just take a moment to take the scene in. Simeon doesn't see Jesus perform a single miracle. This is a baby he holds in his arms. He doesn't hear Jesus preach the Sermon on the Mount. He doesn't watch him calm the storm. He holds a baby, this helpless, squirming infant. And in that moment, looking into the eyes of that child, he knows he's holding God's salvation for the entire universe. The ache Simeon felt with and lived with, his deep hope, in that moment gets fulfilled. Not in this grand triumphant display of God rippling his muscles and showing what power, but in a fragile little baby. You know, we're led so often to look for our hopes in all the big things, aren't we? The thing that will take the ache you feel away. It comes through success or power or achievement or a perfectly curated life. Boy, those are all misplaced hopes that never fill the greatness of your soul. Simeon found out that the consolation of Israel, the comfort that takes away the ache, it's not a political movement, it's not an event, it's not a change in your circumstances. It's a person. Here is God's salvation, a tiny baby, a helpless infant in his arms. No wealth, no armies, no palaces, just this vulnerable embodiment of God's love breaking into this world. A love so fierce it takes the shape of weakness. And Simeon sings out, "My eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles." It's so interesting. Here's this Jewish person singing, who's been hoping for the consolation of Israel, but now seeing Jesus says, "Oh no, this is way bigger. This is for all nations, for all people, for all of us, misfits and outsiders and skeptics." That light of revelation for the Gentiles, that plan and promise of God he sees is for all people. For those of us who just can't seem to get it right, for those of us who think we're too broken, too sinful, too complicated for God to bother with. Simeon's song says, you're in. That baby came for you, for all of you. What Simeon saw in that face of that little child of Jesus was the greater story for the whole world. Simeon realized that the promise of God was not just for Israel, but it was for the brokenness of a whole planet, for all nations, for all creation. That story of God that he had participated in, all of a sudden he realized it is broken open so that it makes sense of even the Romans who are there. All the miserable circumstances he's experienced, all the waiting and the heartache, it all fits. It has been given meaning through this child, this story. It's a comfort, it's a consolation that allows Simeon to even face death. Now dismiss your servant in peace, he says. I can die now, God. I'm at peace. Do you have that sort of comfort in your life, that sort of consolation, that sort of meaning that makes sense of all of your living and even your dying? That's the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It offers us what every human heart most desperately needs and wants. J.R.R. Tolkien, novelist who wrote the Lord of the Rings, he once talked about how every human has what he called 5 profoundly deep longings in their heart. He says 5 of them. One is we all want to step outside of time. He realizes that there's something in each of us that realizes there's more to life than this physical world. And so we're fascinated by the idea of stepping outside of time. Secondly, we want to escape. We want to defeat death. We don't want death to be the last word on our lives. Third, we want to communicate with non-human beings. And you think, really? But come on, think of all the stories and movies with talking animals and dragons and every kind of alien, even zombie films, right? We want to talk with non-human beings. Fourthly, we want a love that never goes away. A love where there's no parting. Because once you experience love, boy, it's like, I want to keep this going, right? And lastly, we want to see good triumph over evil. All those 5 things, he says, are just sit in the human heart, and we long for it terribly. And that's why, he says, we write and create stories and movies in which all these things sort of happen, all those longings. Where do they come from? And he says they're sort of like a gene memory deep inside every human being. This gene memory that gets passed along, that becomes part of our DNA. Deep inside every human soul, there is this memory of what the world was created to be like. But it's not like that any longer because we turned away from God. I mean, that's the whole story of what the Bible's telling us. So think about it if this is true. If Christmas is true, if Jesus Christ was born into this world, if Jesus Christ was crucified, as history tells us, if the resurrection really happened, and if you believe in him, every one of those 5 things is going to happen to you. You will know all these things, those deep longings. You will step outside of time. You will escape death eventually. You will know true love without ever breaking, without ever parting. You will communicate with non-human beings, angels, and who knows what else. And you will see good triumph over evil. I mean, that's the profound hope of Christmas. And so if there is anyone here who's not sure about whether Christianity is true, if not sure if whether those 5 longings are really true, if Jesus Christ did come to earth as a human being, if he was crucified, died, buried, raised from the dead, wouldn't you at least want all that to be true? I mean, if you're a reasonable person, if you've got a heart, you would want that to be true. And therefore, I can't urge you enough to go explore and see whether it is true. Because that's a hope. That's a powerfully, totally personal hope rooted in history. That's a consolation that will comfort you in your living and in your dying. The gospel offers what every human heart deeply longs for, a meaning that suffering can't take away, a satisfaction that's not based on your circumstances. It's a freedom that doesn't destroy love and community. It's an identity that doesn't crush you. It's a basis for justice that doesn't turn you into a judge. It's a relief from shame and guilt. It's a hope that can enable you to face anything with poise and confidence, even death itself. The Spirit of God prompted Simeon to go into that temple, to look, pay attention. That's the one. The Spirit was led by the Spirit. Simeon was led by the Spirit to the temple that day and was given the eyes of faith to see in that baby the long-awaited Messiah. And God's Spirit still does that today, still moving, still saying to us, look, pay attention. God is at work in this world, and you can see his salvation. So listen for those quiet nudges and promptings of the Spirit, because the Spirit gives the eyes of faith to see Jesus in our midst. Today, like Simeon, you can take Christ into your arms and find yourself held by Christ. Let me close with this. One of the places the church has often experienced that is at communion. Think of that. In the bread, in the cup, when we come to receive it, we hold Christ in our hands. And do you know the traditional prayer the church has often prayed at the end of a communion service? Very often, after seeing and tasting and touching the Lord and becoming united with him in community, the church would often use as a post-communion prayer, Simeon's prayer. Lord, you have placed your Son in my hands, and now I place my life in your hands. Dismiss me in peace. I have seen your salvation. I think we better start doing that after our communion services. Have you felt that ache in your heart lately? Have anxiety and loneliness and meaningless and cynicism, have they been words that describe often how you're feeling? Again, remember, that doesn't mean God's absent from your life. It's a sign in your soul that you are meant for something more. It's a sign of a bigger soul that you have. It's a sign that God is at work, setting up hunger in your life that only Jesus might fill. So listen for Simeon's lullaby. God is singing that, singing into the darkness and messiness a word of comfort for aching hearts. Singing this beautiful comfort and consolation that you too can be held by the Savior of the world. Let's pray. Jesus, I pray that you would sing Simeon's lullaby to each one of our hearts. Would you bring the profoundest consolation and comfort to the ache each one of us carries? Give us that deep, fierce hope that you are at work in this world, that our lives matter because you have included us in this beautiful good work of the gospel. We praise you in your name. Amen.